everybody. My name is Tim Westcott and I'm one of the planners in the Smart Planning program at DELP in the Rules and Policy stream. Thanks for joining us and welcome to this special live stream presentation as part of DELP's Smart Planning program. The purpose of today's presentation is to provide councils across the state with some more information about one of Smart Planning's key reform projects, the proposed planning policy framework. Now we know that this is one of the reform items which generated a lot of interest from the whole planning community, but particularly local government during consultation on last year's VPP reform discussion paper. The main focus for today will be to bring you up to date with some of the key initiatives we have undertaken in progressing the project, and in particular around preparing 2 full pilot PPFs for the Manningham and Ballarat planning schemes in consultation and with the assistance of the 2 councils. We are lucky enough today to have some of the people involved in that project here to provide you with first-hand insights, and I'll introduce them to you now. So we've got John Keaney here, who's many of you will know is an experienced planning consultant who's undertaken many planning scheme reviews and undertook both LPPF translations. I've got Lisa Kendal here, who's the Manager of Strategic Planning at the City of Ballarat. Vivien Williamson, who's the Manager of City Strategy at the City of Manningham, and Kristen Sullivan, who is part of DELP's Smart Planning team working on the PPF, and she's on secondment from Darebin Council with us at the moment. So thanks to all of them for providing their time today and throughout this project. We'll hear from them shortly and they can provide you with their perspectives on the pilot project. Now, one important message I need to give up front is that both councils kindly agreed to participate in this pilot, but I want to point out the outputs have not been endorsed by either council. Council officers were involved from a technical perspective, and the products which were created were developed to test the PPF concept on real planning schemes, rather than for the explicit purpose of developing a whole new policy framework for either council. So, the agenda for today is that I'll provide an overview of the PPF concept, and then John, Vivien and Lisa will provide their observations. At the end, we're hoping to have a question and answer session where we can try and answer your questions live here at the panel. I would encourage you to send in questions directed to any of today's speakers while we're presenting, and we'll do the best we can to try and answer some of your questions at the end. Any questions we don't get to, the Smart Planning team will endeavour to get back to you later on. To submit a question, I think you click on the bubble that you should be able to see on your screen. And also I've been told if you could include your email address, then we can get back to people afterwards if we don't get to questions today. I wanted to provide you, first of all, with an insight into some of the work that's been going on and to develop the PPF. Since we undertook consultation on the project last year, the project team has been working hard to improve and refine the model, including changes based on learnings from the pilot and other technical reference group feedback. This work has included refining the thematic framework of the PPF, the development of state policy to fill gaps, and the redistribution of regional policy under the relevant thematic headings. We've also been working on some additional VPP tools to support the PPF, and I'll take you through some of those in a moment. In parallel to preparing the planning scheme changes, we've also been working on guidance, material and operational provisions to help planning authorities use the PPF and undertake future translations. And of course, we've been testing the model to make sure it's fit for purpose. In addition to the full PPF pilots undertaken with Ballarat and Manningham, we've been doing some additional testing on some local policy themes that are particularly common, for example, place-based policy. Now, before we talk specifically about the pilot project, I just wanted to address 2 of the burning issues which we know are of interest to local governments and which relate to how any rollout of the PPF may occur and the implications for any planning scheme reviews which are underway. Firstly, to deal with the planning scheme reviews, the department is finalising an amendment package to introduce the PPF for consideration by the Minister. Now, if approved, it's expected that this will be gazetted around mid-2018. Now, as you'll be aware, this coincides with the 30th of June 2018 requirement under the Act for the review of planning schemes. And so it's been decided to extend this required date to the 31st of December 2018 for those councils that wish to complete their review informed by details of the Smart Planning Amendment. If a council wishes to finalise the review process by the original 30th of June 2018 timeline, department officers will continue to provide advice on the amendment as it becomes available. A letter will be on its way to council shortly to confirm this approach. The second point then is around implementation. So we recognise the need to provide assistance to council to implement the reforms, and support for councils has been included in a funding bid that is being considered as part of this annual budget cycle. So hopefully we'll know pretty soon. At the moment, the intention is that an amendment would introduce the PPF state and regional content into the VPP and planning schemes, leaving the existing LPPFs to operate as they currently do for the time being. So there would be no immediate change for councils, and interim operational provisions would support this structure. Over time then, local content could be translated once the work is undertaken by each council, with timing to be determined by a range of factors, which could include the availability of funding, or the sort of amendments that each council had live at any time. DELP will provide further advice about the implementation process once the final form of any reforms is known, and the outcome of the funding bid is known. Hopefully today's presentation will provide some useful lessons around how current planning scheme reviews and any proposed updates to council's planning policies can be tailored to help transition into the new framework. So, moving now to the focus of today's presentation, I just wanted to provide a recap on the basics of the PPF model to help you understand the approach, and before we get into a discussion about findings from the pilot process. And as the little cartoon you can see on the screen says, it's both perhaps a crossroads and uncharted territory, but hopefully you'll see plenty in the proposed structure that is fairly familiar to you. So the PPF merges the SPPF and LPPF into a single policy source. Under the proposal, state, regional and local policy would be grouped by theme, with relevant regional and local policies nested under the corresponding state policy. The framework can be tailored for each planning scheme, so that only the relevant regional or sub-regional policy would appear, as shown on the slide. Planning and responsible authorities will be required to uniformly take account of and give effect to all three levels of policy, so as regional and local tiers will derive from and relate to the state policy. Although this is a significant change to the policy framework, it is important for everyone to understand there are many familiar elements. For a start, each planning scheme will contain a municipal planning strategy, which will be a refined and more concise version of the MSS. It will be very much focused on telling the local story for each municipality and setting out the key strategic drivers which explain and direct the policies and controls used in the planning scheme. This will be a focused and direct message which sets out the council's planning aspirations. The PPF itself will be broadly structured around the current SPPF themes and follow a familiar internal structure. However, the team here has been doing a considerable amount of work to ensure that this thematic structure is fit for purpose. This means that we have identified gaps in the policy framework, and we are preparing new policy headings and state policies to accommodate some local policy themes. So examples might include amenity-based policies such as non-residential uses in residential zones, and also place-based policies. So this slide provides a conceptual illustration of the process of moving from an LPPF to a PPF model. Here you can see our current buckets of policy. So the state policy at clauses 11 to 19, regional sub-clauses in clause 11, and then the MSS and local policies. The same themes and content can be repeated across all these different areas. So in this case, theme 1, which is in purple, let's say it could be about industry, you could have those same industry objectives repeated in the SPPF, in regional policy, in the MSS, and potentially in local policy as well. We'll now see how this looks like under the PPF. So the PPF is an integrated model, so all three levels of policy will sit in clauses 11 to 19. Local and regional content will be translated to sit under the relevant policy themes. Now, hopefully you can see then the policy move around to sit under those policy themes. So in the case of our hypothetical model here, theme 1 has retained content at state, regional and local level. And in fact, in this case, there's two policies at local level. For theme 2, it turns out there's no relevant regional policy, as this is already covered by state policy. And so in this case, though, there's some local policy which has been retained to provide specific local direction. For theme 3, the hypothetical translation review here determined there was no value being added by regional or local policy because it was already covered by state policy. So in this case, state policy is all that's required under theme 3. Now we can also see here, alongside this is the municipal planning strategy, which will sit up front at clause 2 of the planning scheme and set out the municipal context, the council's land use vision and the strategic drivers. Framework plans also provide a picture of how the municipality will change based on the policies and controls in the scheme. And finally, here we see the relationship between the different elements. So state policy continues to provide that overarching direction, which is then tailored at a local level through the municipal planning strategy and then feeds back into local policies and controls. Now, as part of this process, it's been identified there's a need to strengthen some other planning provisions which can support local policy by allowing for additional local content in various schedules. At present, local policies can include content which in fact relates specifically to the application of an individual control, such as an overlay. So it's proposed here that the provisions which currently sit in local policy, some provisions which currently sit in local policy would in fact more logically sit in the relevant schedule. The zones, overlays and particular provisions proposed to be amended are listed on the slide, as you can see there. There we are. So you can see there some of the additional content headings proposed to be added to these schedules, and these changes will vary depending on the schedule in question. So for example, under the proposed approach there's going to be a greater consistency between all the environmental overlays, so they can all include local objectives, application requirements and decision guidelines. Another example, the farming zone schedule would include local purposes, so they could match the rural activity zone schedule. It's proposed also that the heritage overlay schedule would allow for the inclusion of incorporated statements of significance and design guidelines. Finally, the schedule to clause 52.28 on gaming would be expanded to allow for the translation of local gaming content, for example, by including location criteria. Okay, now we've got to our pilot. So, I've given you an overview of the PPF concept, and let's now move to the testing of that concept, which took place through our pilot project in partnership with officers from Ballarat and Manningham. Before we hear from the participants, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the pilot process. So the pilot was about testing the PPF model to understand the implications, basically whether it worked and the implications for implementing it as we go forward. We had a fair bit of interest from various councils about participating in the pilot, and thank you for those that expressed an interest. Unfortunately, due to time and resource limitations, we're not able to accommodate everyone. The reasons for selecting Ballarat and Manningham were that, firstly, their schemes cover a variety of spatial typology. So they have rural areas, they've got growth areas, got activity centres, heritage areas and the like. Secondly, between them, both planning schemes contained a good cross-section of existing local policies, so everything from ESD to gaming to non-residential uses, rural dwellings and those kind of things. Lastly, the styles of the two LPPFs are quite different. So Manningham has what we call a classic LPPF in that it's based on a fairly traditional format and approach. Ballarat's, on the other hand, is a very recent LPPF in that it's been largely rewritten and revised over the last 2 years. So I just wanted to give you an example of, I guess because people won't have seen exactly what a PPF policy looks like, so I wanted to show you an example of how we, when John did the translations, it worked through what an agriculture policy looks like in the Ballarat planning scheme. And so this is the policy framework you might consider, for example, if you're looking at an application for a dwelling in a farming zone. So to start off, here you can see what I've highlighted here in the purple boxes is the policy framework that would be considered in the Ballarat planning scheme today. So you can see here the relevant state policy for agriculture at clause 14.01. Here is the relevant regional policy from the Central Highlands RGP at clause clause 11.08. And here we have the local policy from both the MSS and clause 22. So there it is. So then through the pilot, each existing line in the LPPF was analysed having regard to discussions with councils to understand key priorities and which parts of the planning scheme remain relevant and vital for decision making. For each policy provision, a decision was made about whether it should be retained, relocated, edited and amalgamated or discarded. So here's an example related from the Ballarat MSS, the current MSS policy on agriculture. as you can see, in some cases, MSS content was translated to a local policy section at clause 14.01-2, which sets out policy on agricultural land uses. However, strategy 1.1, which is existing at the moment, has been deleted as it directly duplicates the Central Highlands regional policy. Ballarat also has a specific clause 22 policy on rural dwellings and subdivision. Now, this is clearly important in providing decision makers with very specific guidance about applications in the farming zone and provides a lot more detail than a state and regional policy. In this case, some items from clause 22.06 have been translated into the local section of clause 14.01-1, which relates to protection of agricultural land. So, this local policy about rural dwellings and subdivision becomes Ballarat's expression of implementing the state policy to protect agricultural land. Now, as you can see in the annotations there, the top yellow item became a strategy, while the second and third yellow items were translated to become policy guidelines as they relate to more specific decision-making criteria. Some redundant text has been deleted, which you can see in red, and then the green text relates to application requirements. Now, application requirements are not policy, so in this case they would either need to be recrafted as an objective or strategy or simply used as a checklist for councils to hand out at the counter as to how applications will need to meet the tests in the policy. And now this is a view of the complete translated PPF policy at clause 14.01-1. So in the black text here is the state policy, which is essentially the existing SPPF policy. That's followed then by the regional strategies from the Central Highlands, which are shown in blue for the purpose of this exercise, and set out what's regionally significant about agriculture. And then lastly, in purple, we have the local policy following directly afterwards for rural dwellings and subdivision, significantly reduced in length from the current version, but retaining its intent. So together, these are providing a coherent and complete set of policy for protecting agricultural land in the one place in the planning scheme. Now, some of the existing content was also translated to the municipal planning strategy. Here we have reproduced the strategic directions from the MPS relating to agriculture. So these provide a concise explanation of why agriculture is important to Ballarat, key threats, and broadly what council wants to achieve through its planning scheme about this land use. Lastly, this is a more detailed zoom into the local section of clause 14.01-1, and hopefully you can see it looks pretty familiar. So there's the internal structure includes a policy application saying it applies to the farming zone, it's got objectives, it's got strategies, and it's got policy guidelines which provide more specific criteria for decision making, for example around the size of land or the need for a section 173 agreement in this case. So hopefully that gives you a good picture of what a translated LPPF policy looks like under the PPF format. So I'll now hand over to John Keaney and he can take you through a bit more detail about the pilot process.
Thank you, Tim. I'd like to just touch on three areas this afternoon. I wanted to briefly overview the methodology that I used. Secondly, and importantly, the lessons that I learned and others learned from the exercise, and then finally to make some final observations. Tim's already noted the difference between the two schemes, Ballarat and Manningham, and that's a critical issue for any council in contemplating how to go about this restructure. Manningham's the classical traditional model has evolved over time, and there on interrogation it was pretty evident there was material there that had been there for a long time. Ballarat's was quite different, restructured only 2 years ago and very strictly in the SPPF format using those headings. Interestingly though, it had local policies as well that hadn't been done at the same time, and they were of a more classical traditional model. So there was something of a cocktail between both schemes. I think the same principles will apply as we go through the overview. In doing this exercise, I didn't change any of the words that the councils provided. That wasn't the task. It was to take the material that was there and to put it into the new structure. This first step is to start with the existing LPPF and, as Tim said, an annotated version of that. Every line, every clause has to be identified for its origins, as when it's redistributed, we need to know where it's come from. The second and really important step in this process was the council entry meeting. at which time I attended both Manningham and Ballarat, and with other staff walked through every line of their MSS. And in doing that, we were able to initially identify where each clause might be best positioned in the new PPF structure. I then went away and did that redistribution of the LPPFs into the most convenient PPF home, and ended up with a first cut, and thereafter I did 2 very thorough edits of reading every word of state, then regional and then local, to identify the areas that needed to be retained, those that could be deleted, those where there was repetition, and those that were actually in the wrong spot on the first cut and needed to be put somewhere else. At the end of those 2 edit downs, I met again with the council and walked them through a final or a working draft, at which time the council and ourselves basically identified what the final version should look like. That whole exercise, in the scope of the works that were set out, we allowed roughly 2 weeks for each council to do this, to undertake that exercise. Now, there's no question that more time would be better and you would keep tweaking it. However, the really important lessons, I think, emerged in the first or second edits. And in particular, one of the most important lessons emerged, I think, from the council entry meeting, and that was what I think was a bit of an unintended consequence of the project, but it was the importance of this as a planning scheme review tool. You will all be undertaking planning scheme reviews, and you'll all be rewriting schemes from time to time. And I've done many of them. This was the most effective tool I've used in terms of, with the councils, identifying on a line-by-line basis those elements of the scheme that were absolutely necessary to retain, those that were very dated, those that were repetitious of the state and or its own local policy. And importantly, for a review, it identified gaps. With the PPF headings and working through those, councils were saying there are elements that we actually feel we need to cover off on, and we haven't done that. And so that immediately became apparent as a gap in their local policy framework. My advice, irrespective of the outcome of the PPF project, is that any council about to embark on a rewrite as a result of your review, do so with the SPPF headings in mind, because that will make for the most seamless transition in the event that the PPF comes to fruition, and if it doesn't, it allows for the clearest relationship between the existing SPPF and your new LPPF. The second lesson is something Tim also touched on, and it's something of a cultural change to the way we all started doing the VPP process 20 years ago, and that was the stronger emphasis on policy. Now, without diminishing the role of policy, it's pretty clear from this exercise that the role of the controls in the VPPs, particularly zone and overlay schedules, have a highlighted position. And this became apparent in in both schemes. In Ballarat, they have an environmental significance overlay dealing with koala habitat protection, clearly an important issue. And they have an ESO that's filled out to a point, an ESO schedule. Ballarat also has in their MSS discussion about the koala habitat protection area and a local policy to complement that. There's great scope to rationalise those, and the message emerging from the smart planning process is to, as the first home, have that in a control. And clearly the ESO is the best control in this case. So I grabbed a lot of what was in ESO, what was in the MSS and local policies on koala habitat, and found a home for that in the ESO schedule number 5. Manningham had a slightly different one. One of their most important foundation strategic projects in the last decade or more has been the Doncaster Hill area, and really important strategic work that's led to really important strategies, which are all in the MSS. What's also come to fruition is that all of that and more is now in an activity centre zone schedule in Manningham. And the MSS words do little, if anything, to add to what's already in the ACZ schedule. So it was quite an easy exercise to delete that from its MSS on the basis of repetition and being unnecessary. However, to the point that I suggested, well, we probably don't even need to say anything about Doncaster Hill in your MSS. Well, I think there's some concern, would be naturally from some concern from Manningham if that were the case, or any, let's say, rural council that had done a rural land use strategy, or any regional council that might have done a housing strategy, and all the work that had gone into that, for it to be ignored in your MSS. So what I did was have a fairly brief inclusion of that in the PPF as a signpost to, in this case, the ACZ, or in Ballarat's case, to ESO 5. The next lesson that I learned, and I think all of the players learned, was the degree to which this exercise highlighted state policy. Now, I've been involved around these reviews and rewrites for many years, and many of you have as well, and perhaps we all think we know what's in state policy, and it really wasn't until I did this exercise that some of the fine detail and nuances in local policy became apparent to me. Having, as Tim just displayed on the screen, for agriculture, using the Ballarat example, having state policy and immediately after having the Central Highlands regional context and then local policy made for a very seamless read down of the issues, but it took you to state policy as a first port of call. I think that's something that's probably been missing over the last 10 or 15 years in our analysis of state and local policy. I wanted to touch now on another lesson, which was what's become known as Clause 2, or the municipal planning strategy. In the structure originally of this project, we had a home at the start for a municipal context, but much of the narrative was going to be left in the PPF. And after 3 versions, and in fact having had the exit version with councils, we still had what I felt was a rather disjointed approach of having a municipal context at the front and then delving into the PPF, where we had objectives and strategies that were punctuated by narrative about local issues. We in the end decided to reposition all of that narrative and local narrative and bulked up the Clause 2 at the front, so that in the end it became what I'd call for what I've referred to as a mini MSS. And in fact, I think what we had in mind conceptually 20 years ago when we first thought of the term municipal strategic statement. Short, sharp, punchy overview of the municipality and an identification of the key strategic directions around the key themes. It avoided some of the bulkiness that can go into it, some of the existing MSSs, and I focused very much on land use planning outcomes. I'm comforted to hear that seemed to be the model that's the most acceptable, and it not only elevates, I think, local strategy to that front end, it forces us to write that really tightly and properly, but it leaves the back end, the PPF, clauses 11 to 19, for objectives and strategies around all of the key issues. Tim touched on the fact that there were a number of local policies that are included in LPPFs at the moment that have no convenient home in either the SPPF now or the PPF in the future, and they are things like gaming, ESD, and those sorts of issues. There are other aspects of Clause 21, as you'd know, like further strategic work, other actions, zone and overlay implementation, that tend to bulk up existing MSSs and get very repetitive. Now, one of the outcomes of this project is not just the PPF model, but it's a revised VPP model where there will be homes for a number of these elements that are in LPPFs today, but where there is no home for them in the PPF. You've heard that Clause 52.28, which relates to gaming, and many of you know there are gaming policies right across the state. There's consistency between a number of those policies, and they can be rebadged and repositioned in a modified schedule to Clause 52.28. ESD is an interesting one. Manningham have a standalone ESD position in their MSS, an ESD local policy, and many of their schedules trespass into that area as well. There's no convenient home in the PPF for that. I redistributed their ESD as best I could into the most convenient homes, but it's true to say that this aspect of it did evolve through the pilot, and I'm told, as I understand it, the position will be that it's most likely that an ESD home will in fact be found in the PPF model as it comes out. Issues like further strategic work will have their own clause in a restructured VPP. Zone and overlay implementation will have its own clause. Reference documents will have their own clause, probably augmenting Clause 81, which is for incorporated documents. A little message on all of that: be ruthless in your review and in your rewrites of further strategic work and reference documents, because they can grow like topsy, and unless you edit those out that are unnecessary, you'll end up with pages and pages of unnecessary material. I've touched on the changes that were made through the pilot. Clause 2 changed considerably. We've touched on the ESD. There was a new clause in the early PPF that I worked with called amenity management, which essentially was for non-residential uses in residential zones, things like that. That's now been rebadged as land use compatibility, and clearly there's a need for that, and the PPF now finds a home for it. That Ballarat example that Tim showed you was another important change that emerged through the pilot, whereby for Ballarat there was an objective in relation to rural dwellings and subdivision. There were strategies about how that might be dealt with, and then there was a third tier called policy guideline. And policy guideline is very nitty-gritty stuff, and it'll often contain the numbers. In Ballarat's example there, it identified that an excision would require you to have a dwelling, a lot around a dwelling of at least 1 hectare. So that goes to an extra level and a more general strategy, and that's as I say, embedded there now as a policy guideline. Not everything will need a policy guideline. And in fact, my sense is that the things that will go in policy guideline are the things that really should be the home of what we've always known as local policy at Clause 22. My final observations on this project, starting as I hope I did with an open mind on this, but I accept coming from the position that I've held for some time that recalibrating the front end of schemes was overdue, and that state policy has often been overlooked and local policy's been overloaded. And I think oftentimes they have operated in a parallel universe. And I think this project, if nothing else, avoids that trap and does have a more seamless read down of all of the relevant policy settings. In my view, the pilot project outcomes delivers policy settings that are far preferable to the existing SPPF and LPPF model. Instead of having state and local policy spread over hundreds of pages, the pilot revealed to me, and I think to many of the players, that a rationalised and well-structured policy framework with a focus on land use directions, anchored by that short municipal planning strategy at the front, could be delivered much more succinctly. I think the ultimate outcome for each of the two councils was a tighter policy framework focused on the most critical land use issues for each of those municipalities. There were casualties, perhaps some fatalities in this project, and they were typically matters of repetition, irrelevant narrative, elements that should be located elsewhere in the planning scheme, outdated material, and matters that were beyond the planning schemes to control in the first place. So that was my take on the pilot, and I think now Lisa is going to tell the story from a Ballarat perspective.
Yeah. Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John and Tim. Before I start, I just wanted to say thanks very much for the opportunity to be involved in the pilot as well. We're in the middle of our planning scheme review at the moment, and as John was saying, we have discovered through the process that this is actually a very helpful process to go through in terms of a planning scheme review process, so perfect timing for us. And I also wanted to just very briefly thank of course, John, for the time that he put in, and the team at Council across our strategic and statutory planning areas who put down their pens on other things and knuckled down together to review this document and provide some really valuable feedback. So, yeah, thank you to everyone. So I think that Tim and John have actually covered probably quite a broad range of the issues that we experienced through the pilot process. We did, as I mentioned, we sat down with our strategic and our stat planning team, so we wanted to have discussions about both the policy integrity side of this translation as well as what it would look like in terms of implementation. So I will talk through a couple of things relating to both of those areas. Generally, we found the new policy under the pilot to be really quite superior to the current structure of the SPPF and LPPF. The way that it is streamlined and that there is a strong relationship between the state, where you can understand clearly the relationship between the state, regional and local policies, it's much more evident in the way that it's presented. So we across both areas of planning felt that that would be very beneficial in terms of decision making and helping us understand whether our local policies were adequately covering the local issues that we have. Through the process, as was mentioned earlier, it did give us an opportunity to clearly identify gaps and also to identify to eliminate duplication. So the potential to reduce the size of those enormous policy documents down to something that's much more manageable is definitely going to would be a beneficial outcome. We also did feel that it would be possible to pick up on all of the themes in our PPF through the translation through to the new format, either through the local provisions and controls as discussed, or coming up through to the front end with the municipal planning statement or into the new structure. So we didn't feel as though there was going to be any detrimental losses to our current content. So I did want to make the point that the new structure for us has, I think, really it has helped to elevate the state and regional policy controls, but not at the expense of the local. In fact, it's in some ways allowed the local controls to have, or the emphasis of what is local to be much clearer. So the elimination again of the duplication, or the ability to just focus on what is important at a state level that is equally relevant at a local, it's eliminated some confusion, but it's also really allowed our local priorities to pop and to be very evident what are the areas that we think are significant, and also to help identify areas where we need to do some further strategic work, where we know that we need to have some more local detail around estate issues. So that has been great. I also wanted to mention with the regional policy framework that I also feel that this process will help us to identify, through when we do the review of regional policy documents, we'll get a better understanding of where some of that policy may be elevated from a local level into a regional. Some of the environmental issues are probably a good example of that, so biodiversity assets that are cross-jurisdictional may be better actually having emphasis or being placed in the regional rather than being picked at a local level. So in terms of implementation, I was just going to talk through a few little bits and pieces. I've already mentioned the audit and the planning scheme review, so an absolutely fabulous process to go through that quite methodically, and to, as John was saying as well, to read the SPPF and the state policy with fresh eyes, and maybe to see, knowing that if you're going to be relying on that state policy and removing a reference at local, that in fact that state policy does need to be covering what, So anyway, so that's been quite a fantastic outcome for us. I think streamlining the use of the tools is going to be very, very, very fantastic, and the example that John mentioned about our koala controls, that they may be adequately dealt with through local controls and local provisions, and again eliminating that duplication. But to think quite comprehensively about which is, I think that will be one benefit of this process, is to think in a more considered way about which is the most effective tool, and to have a thinking or a methodology for us to work through to determine which are the tools that are going to be best to deliver the outcomes that we're looking for. And some of the elements of the LPPF going into the local controls, I think as a team we were feeling quite comfortable with that, and that it would be robust in terms of decision making, and in fact may even be clearer and deliver better outcomes, particularly when you're looking at permit triggers and the understanding of what is what the desired outcomes are when you're actually looking at the controls that trigger those permit requirements. I did want to mention as well the municipal planning strategy, the version, the current version that John's drafted, after several iterations where it was like the mini MSS, was feeling as though it had presented the story of our city very well, and providing a lot of clarity around context and the key directions for us for the future. One of the things we did through the process as well was talk a lot about our framework plans. We've got, in our Ballarat strategy, we have a number of plans that were filtered through different parts of the scheme, and the current pilot project actually put them all up into the municipal planning statement, going to call it a strategy, and it actually really felt as though it was telling a very complete story, and one that was easy, probably a lot easier to reference in terms of making decisions. And I did want to mention as well, I know the department are working on guidelines to assist councils, and I've had a little bit of a look at the draft of those, and I think that the tools that will come out to assist, not just to understand the new structure and what the intent is in where to put things and how to implement it, but some of the decision-making tools that will be delivered as part of it will be very helpful to continue to streamline our scheme and make it a lot easier for applicants and council staff to use. So, yeah, thank you. So just handing over to Vivien.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to reiterate everything that Lisa's said. Our experience was very, very similar, apart from the regional aspect, of course. I'd also like to thank Delp and John in particular for the opportunity to be involved. It was crazy. It was incredibly intensive. We were the first cab off the ranks, so there were a few learnings along the way. But I think, similarly to Lisa, we're going to benefit enormously from the contribution that this work will make to our planning scheme review. Rather than have to trawl through our planning scheme and work out the gaps are sitting there right up there, front and centre, when you have to align them against a state or a regional policy. Like John, I've been around long enough to recall when the so-called new format planning schemes were introduced about 20 years ago now, based on the VPPs, ostensibly to reduce the size of our planning schemes. 20 years on, where are we? We're back to very large planning schemes, and most of that is sitting in the LPPF section. I did a quick calculation that our LPPF is currently at 174 pages. The MSS is 125 pages of that. The local policies, there's 18 of them, and there's 69 pages of them. If nothing at all, this process will considerably reduce that and make the planning scheme far easier to use and far more approachable for the community as well, because I don't think we can leave them out of it, because, as you would be well aware, communities like to be intricately involved in the actual tool that we use when we're making decisions. We have been described as a classical or traditional scheme. It's probably true. It hasn't been reviewed, our local planning policy hasn't been reviewed as a whole for some time, which is an issue, but this is a huge opportunity for us. I just want to take you through some of the concerns that we had initially and how they've been dealt with, and our, I suppose, pointers to the future as to what aspects you need to keep a bit of an eye on. We had concerns initially, because we were the first scheme that John worked on, that we couldn't see where things had come from and gone to. That was resolved over the process, but it was critical that we could see that in the new planning policy framework, where had that been in the old system, and what was left behind was equally important. And we kind of didn't work out the left behind part until towards the end, but that was equally important because that pointed out some deficiencies as well. We did have some concerns initially about the basic rationale that we had to start with the state policy and then go down to the local, and what did that mean if there was no state policy? And as John mentioned, that came to the fore in relation to the ESD policy, and hopefully that's now going to be addressed. But that was a critical issue for us. John mentioned the fact that various components of the current LPPF would not be dealt with in the planning policy framework, like the zones and overlays, the further strategic work and that sort of thing. That was difficult for us because we couldn't see what the outcome was going to be, but I think that's being progressed as well, so we'll get a bit better indication shortly as to what that might look like. I suppose one thing that has concerned me, and I'm not sure that I've articulated it well to the department, is the fact that we haven't got a clear handle on what the planning policy framework is about, and it seems that it's going on a slightly different trajectory to the current planning policy framework, state and local, in that the current ones give you a clear indication of where zones and overlays have come from, and that sort of thing. So it's not just a looking forward tool, it's a looking back tool, it's a check-in tool as well, as far as where particular zones and overlays or policies have come from. We would hope that that doesn't get lost, because those elements are equally important for looking back when somebody is seeking a change to the planning scheme or seeking a rezoning or something similar, that we need to be able to see where things have come from. Yes, it might be appropriate they change because it's still within the planning policy framework, but it would be beneficial to us if it gives us that backward, I suppose, rear view mirror as well as the forward planning mirror. I think the role of the background documents still needs to be resolved. So the reference documents, background documents, I'm not sure what the current terminology is, but what their role will be needs to be clarified. But as Lisa mentioned, there's much clearer relationships between state, regional and local policy. There's a far simpler policy context with the removal of duplication, far more usable policy framework. As I mentioned, it's much clearer for the community. There's far less trawling through the planning scheme, and you'll know that people can trawl through it and have different lenses when they trawl through it, but the lenses won't be able to be different because they'll be quite clear to find the policy drivers and the framework for decision making. And there's less likelihood of missing elements of policy and less likelihood of policy conflict. In conclusion, we found the process genuinely collaborative, and as pilot participants we could clearly see that our feedback was actually changing the direction that things were going in. And it was used to improve both the product and other parts of the VPP and the process. For example, when some key elements of the existing LPPF were not included in the PPF, changes were made to the template recognising the need for their inclusion, and John's referred to quite a few of those. I totally agree that the PPF approach will elevate the role of state policy in planning schemes, but I liked Lisa's reference to making the local policy pop, because I totally agree with that. It'll make the line of sight between state, regional and local policy a lot clearer. It'll be out in your face. And for us it'll be very extremely valuable also in the planning scheme review process. Some of the unresolved issues that we have at this stage is because of that total reliance on state policy being sort of the starting point, and I can't argue with that, but it does mean that the role of local government in being at the forefront of some policy development, for example ESD, where does that leave us? If the state if there is an absence of state policy, where does that leave us? And I just hope that we can be flexible enough to address that. It's also not clear what happens, for example, where a new state policy were to be introduced, how would the relevant local policies be introduced to adjust to that quickly, because we all know the planning scheme process is very slow and laborious. It'd be nice to think that if a new policy came up on something, that we would be able to get in there with the local nuances of that as quickly as possible. And similarly, what happens when changes are made to state policies and we end up with inconsistency or conflict or that sort of thing. So you can see we've given it a lot of thought, but it's been incredibly thought-provoking and a very valuable exercise to be involved in, and thanks to everyone for the opportunity. Back to Tim.
Well, I think we're handing over to Kristen now for a Q&A session. Hopefully people have sent in a few questions. Kristen will take us through that.
Yeah, thank you. All right, well we have had some questions come in. I'll start with you, Tim. So councils, a lot of councils are undertaking their reviews, they're redrafting their existing clauses 21 and 22. Questions come through, are they able to continue to prepare their policies and their MSS in the existing format?
The answer to that is yes, in one word. So definitely the recommendation is to continue producing policies in the existing format. But it's useful to have regard to some of the things John talked about in terms of how those policies are being drafted going forward. So I would definitely recommend starting to think about structuring around the SPPF themes, around looking for what state policy and regional policy says, and how is the local policy adding value to that? And looking for ways to reduce your repetition and duplication. Doing all those kind of things will help a future translation to the PPF, if and when it's approved.
John, sort of following on from that, John, when you were undertaking the translations, and I know that you sort of touched on this earlier, what were the main reasons that when you looked at local content that you didn't consider it appropriate to actually translate it into the PPF?
The repetition was a big one. Repetition was in two forms, repetitive of state policy, and a very common example of that was in heritage provisions in LPPFs, which would typically start off with exactly the same objective or strategy that's in the state section. So in reading down, that was an easy strikeout. There was also repetition within the LPPFs. Some councils, not naming these two, but knowledge elsewhere, feel that things have to be said 1, 2, 3 or 4 times to get the message through. And so that became a fairly obvious casualty on my edits. Better VPP tools was a very strong emphasis on going through these drafts, whereby in the two examples I've given of both the Koala area at Ballarat and the ACZ in Manningham, my sense is in both cases there were those MSS positions went in many years ago as a forerunner to the councils doing further work to get them into statutory controls. And when they were into statutory controls in the form of the ESO and the ACZ, the strategic building blocks were just left there and often were word for word or quite similar to what you found in the control. So that was a very clearly one I looked at. I was pretty brutal on anything that was irrelevant to the planning scheme, and that went out, and that was a fairly easy edit, as was dated material. Now, you'll come across material where there's reference to the 2001 census or the 2006 council plan or that sort of material was fairly obvious stuff that could be removed.
Thanks, John. Lisa, a question for you. Did you test any aspects of the proposed PPF with your statutory planners, and did you get a sense of how it might affect decision making?
Thank you. So as I mentioned, we did work through our response and feedback with the stat team as well as the strategic team. So in general, the feeling was that the new structure would be very enabling in terms of making decisions that were had a stronger relationship with policy, or that it would be much easier to very clearly understand what the local policy requirements were, and of course regional and state if there's no specified local. But just to not be flipping around through the scheme trying to understand the potential to bring some of the content through into other controls, I think was also seen favourably. The comment just before about further work, which I think we had talked about as a group, that at times that can be distracting and that people can misunderstand the intent of something being identified for further work, that it actually wasn't giving guidance around that topic at all in the scheme, but it was identifying a need for further work. So we certainly welcome that coming out of the front end of the scheme and going into a separate control, a separate tool that would be much clearer, so that people don't get distracted by that or misinterpret. We did provide DELP with some of our, this is a question without notice to Tim, but the department was looking at a couple of our planning permit applications to look at the implications. Is that something that would be good to comment on? Have you,
yes.
has that work been done?
Well,
yeah.
well, it hasn't been finished yet, so it has been started. So we got something we didn't talk about before, but we asked both Manningham and Ballarat for some examples of a few permit applications that we could test, just to compare from a more statutory planning perspective or permit assessment perspective. How usable was the PPF for the purpose of assessing those applications versus what the was done under the original original permit or application assessment, which which had already been done. So that work hasn't quite been completed yet. So sorry, I don't have anything to really add to that. But in the midst of all the many things going on, but it's definitely something we're doing. So I guess we just wanted to dot the I's and cross the T's in terms of this testing process to make sure we'd covered off that side of things as well. So yes, hopefully hopefully it'll bring up good results as well. Yeah.
I think also, sorry, just from a decision-making perspective, John, you would remember we talked at length about our heritage controls and incorporated documents. So I suppose what this process has done is made it very evident that we need to revisit some of those so that they're much more user-friendly, much easier to understand the intent and to bring out of the LPPF into the controls the most important things that need to be considered. We had a lot of repetition, and also some of the documents that would be used to assess applications were not providing the clarity. So we did find ourselves through this process talking in quite a bit of detail about some of those things as well.
Tim, with the further strategic work and in particular the implementation of zones and overlays, questions come through asking, well, why are they being retained? Because they don't, often seem to add value.
Okay, well, a couple of things there. So the implementation sections of MSSs, which sort of talks about, using these zones, these overlays and so on, there's actually a requirement under the Act that we have something in the MSS or that shows how you've applied the policy into aspects of the planning scheme. So legally, until there's a change to the Act, we have to keep that material. So, certainly there's a lot of feedback we've got that's not that useful, although maybe it does help. Vivien's point before about the sort of rear view mirror, maybe in fact it does actually have a point. So, so the idea is that we certainly keep that, but take it out of the core bits of the policy parts of the planning scheme and put it into one of the provisions up the back that sort of provides, I guess, more background information. And with the further strategic work, actually, conversely, that's a section that we found we were getting quite positive feedback about. So people actually were saying, well, we actually use that to help justify getting funding for a planning scheme, for a review of this or the next bit of strategic work. So with that in mind, even though in this case there's no requirement under the Act to have that material, we're proposing to keep that as well. But again, just relocate it out of the core bit of the policy framework and put it in a different bit of the planning scheme. So both those sections are being retained under the proposal for quite different reasons, really. Did you have any comments you wanted to make about either of those? No.
Vivien, a question for you. Do you get any sense of how the PPF might affect the approach of council when they're undertaking policy development?
Yes, I think it's going to be critical for the way we undertake policy development. I mean, just the planning scheme review itself it's going to be incredibly helpful. It's going to be much easier to see the policy alignment and the policy gaps, and I think you don't spend half your project time trying to identify those as part of your policy redevelopment. Often there's a call for policy at the moment to address specific issues with a lack of knowledge by both sometimes council's own planners, but usually more the community and councillors, that there is a policy already that addresses that issue, either at the state or the regional or the local policy level. So from a planning authority and point of view as far as reviewing and refining our planning scheme, it'll be incredibly helpful to have this sort of framework in place.
I'll just add to that, just doing some of the extra piloting work which I mentioned before around sort of place-based policies. I really found in looking at some examples of place-based policies from various councils, the number of provisions in there which just didn't add much value to the decision making, and I think it will be a really useful tool in terms of making sure local policy is as effective as it can be and actually doing what the council wants it to achieve, and are those words actually doing what we want? Are they building on what's already there? I think it's a really powerful tool to help build local policy and make it more effective.
Can I just add one point that I think also it'll probably set us up for some potential conflict as well, because once we see that the lack of alignment between policy, or we don't like the direction that the state policy is taken us in, there potentially will be some robust discussion to have, because I think we identified, John, in our, I think it was bushfire policy, there's actual conflict at the moment. I think that was caused by the timing of amendments, but they're the sort of things I think we'll probably have to nut out as this process goes further down the track.
I think it's an important point to make that neither state nor local or regional or local policy is static. So, there's always going to be opportunities for change, and even at the moment, you still have to, at a local level, you still have to get state approval for your local policy. So I don't, that aspect won't change. It's just sort of in a different format, but it's a really good point to make. John, a question for you. Do you think that the PPF will elevate the weight of local policy at VCAT?
I think it will be much, it'll be as Vivien said, it'll be just there in front of your face, that connection between state, regional and local. I think having that section of policy guidelines, nitty-gritty stuff for rural subdivision and dwelling, for non-residential uses, whatever the case may be, will be of great assistance to the tribunal. They will, like all of us, have to wade through and balance loads and loads of material. Submissions to the tribunal can be very long, just going through the policy framework. I expect that to be truncated enormously, and I think that the clarity of policy of local policy will emerge for them. So that'd be a positive outcome.
Thanks, John. Tim, what's the lots of councils have things like local area plans in their MSSs and local place policies in their Clause 22s. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what the provision for those sorts of things, will they exist under the PPF? How are they being dealt with?
Yeah, so this was a very important bit of feedback we got through the discussion paper last year about councils wanting to retain their local place-based policies, which and so that's certainly been taken on board. We're creating a new planning for places section of the in the planning policy framework, and so that will handle a whole range of different topic areas, including sort of activity centre planning, and various other things. But then there's a clause being left essentially open for, I think it's titled regional and local places, and that is specifically designed that existing area-based plans, whether they're for sites or townships or suburbs or whatever they might be, if they're still relevant, if there's a place for integrated place-based planning, then that's the place for them to go. Now, having done it, we did a bit of testing on this, and it was apparent that in fact many existing place-based policies, once you start to strip out the duplication with the state bits and the regional bits, in fact there's a lot less of it. And so I think some of those, if they're only about one particular theme, in fact they may be, that policy may be better to sit under the housing section or the the settlement section or whatever it might be. But if there is still truly a need for integrated place-based policy that covers a whole range of environment and settlement and neighbourhood character and commercial, what's your town centre look like and all that sort of thing, then absolutely there's a place for that in the PPF, and we would envisage that's where most of that policy will end up.
That was just making me think about the community's relationship with the planning scheme. So as Vivien was saying before, it's a very important document to tell the story of the community's aspirations for a place, and we're doing a lot of local area planning, and we'll be looking to find a home, and we do have some elements in the scheme at the moment, but it will be interesting. I think I'm very mindful that our community are very interested to ensure that our scheme maintains its integrity in telling that local story. and I know the way that the pilot's currently been drafted, it's certainly got elements of that where we have existing policy around it. There was a component that ended up in the municipal planning strategy as well as further down. John, do you have any comments on, sorry to ask a question, but I was just thinking, I know when I read the new municipal planning strategy, I actually was wondering about the detail that would go in there around local area or place-based planning relative to the other sections.
Well, I think if you take in your scheme Miners Rest and Manningham were referred to, we've repositioned that, the narrative around those to the clause 2, the planning strategy at the front. But under a heading in local places, we've got the strategies, objectives and strategies and some guidelines for each of those towns. In the Manningham case, we had the only one, I think, from memory that we left there was the Eastern Golf Club site as a standout local place where there'd been planning done and needed to be done. And that's a really interesting one where in time that will be developed in accordance with its development plan, and probably there will be no need to carry that forward. In the case of Miners Rest, Manningham, Canadian Valley and others, Learmonth, etc. in Ballarat, I could imagine the narrative at the front being modified as we've done further work, and definitely the objectives and strategies being modified as the community signs off on a community plan or a structure plan.
All right, well that's all the questions we have time for this afternoon. So Tim, I'll hand back to you for our next steps.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for answering questions. Just before we finish up, I just wanted to highlight the work that will be taking place going forward through the PPF project in the Smart Planning Program. So we are currently working on finalising the amendment documents to prepare an amendment to the VPP to introduce the PPF, and that will obviously be taken up through to the Minister for consideration. So that work is ongoing. At the same time, we're preparing the guidance material to help inform the rollout and use of the PPF, including translation guidance to help, which has been informed by the pilot process. We will obviously be working on the implementation program, which I touched on before, which will be very much influenced by the outcomes of the budget process. And we are also working with our colleagues in the systems stream of smart planning to ensure that the PPF can be implemented through the new PSIM system, which is obviously the online digital planning schemes. So all that, there's a lot of work going on at the moment, and that will continue to happen right throughout the rest of the smart planning program. So just to finish up then, if you want any further information, please see our website or email the Smart Planning inbox through the email address that's on your screen there. A version of this presentation will be saved and uploaded to the DELP website if you or your colleagues would like to see the information that's been presented. And finally, just a big thanks again for watching, and a big thank you to our guests, Vivien, John and Lisa, for coming along and being part of the pilot and being here today. It's been really much appreciated, a pleasure to work with you all. So that's it. Have a lovely afternoon.